Hi everyone. I think I'm live. Great to be here at the Global Azure Austria, and I think it's my third or fourth time at this great event. Always talking about something about containers or GitHub. First time that I kind of combined those two topics, and I want to give you a little bit of a kickstart into your container journey with Azure Container Apps and GitHub Actions. So we will have a look at these kind of two technologies. My avatar is still placed in GatherTown on the Microsoft booth. So if there's any questions afterwards, come visit me at the Microsoft booth in GatherTown at this event. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them into the chat. And I think the organizers can drop them into my second screen on this side. And I will try to answer the questions also during this presentation. So my name is Jürgen. I work with customers on the topics on containers, Kubernetes, applications, DevOps, GitHub, a lot of things that we at Microsoft kind of bundle into the topic of application innovation. So that's my official role, application innovation specialist at Microsoft Austria. You find a couple of links here where you can reach out to me. And if you want to meet in person, I'm also the organizer of the Cloud Native Computing Linz meetup. We usually meet once a month. So you're very welcome also to join in one of our next editions. Yeah, I got a couple of different certifications every now and then. I do I do like to take the challenge to get certified on the one or the other technology. And if you want to learn more, let's connect on LinkedIn, or you can also follow me on Twitter. So for today's topic, what do we have? We're talking about applications today. And here it says the app of the future is cloud native, but I think it's not the app of the future, but it's how we are nowadays developing modern software. So this should be kind of already the paradigm, how we are developing software. We usually put them into containers to allow for a couple of different factors. So we want to have our applications loosely coupled. We want them to be resilient. We want them to be manageable and observable. It's only a couple of factors that are important for nowadays applications, because we also need to maximize the business impact of our applications and to increase developer velocity. And that's best possible with the cloud native mindset in the back of our heads. So what does it mean for kind of to increase developer velocity? It's basically driving higher innovation, being faster with new features, having the possibility to write better software, to also to increase developer satisfaction. There's a lot of topics and buzz around GitHub Copilot, for example, which is really a great tool also for developers to be like really excited on their day-to-day job. And it's also important that we write great software, that we have high innovation in our software, because we also want to drive the revenue and we want to have the impact on the business. And this is what's important also when we're writing software. So in the cloud native space, we can really then leverage the software that we write. We can leverage the cloud because it gives us the possibility, for example, to scale. That's one of the big benefits of the cloud, of the Azure cloud, to scale to meet any demand. Also, to be able to develop software really fast, to push innovation to your customers, and with that also to deliver the better applications just faster to your customers. And we will see later in the demo how you can really combine Azure Container Apps and GitHub Actions to really give you this power to deliver your applications faster. So where can we put Azure Container Apps? Having a little bit of a look on the landscape of Azure, where could we put it? And we can see it here. I think my mouse is I have the pointer here, which does not do any good for you if I point this directly to my screen. But have a look at the screen. In the second row, you will find Azure Container Apps right between Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Functions. And I think it's pretty well placed there because it's actually a service on top of Azure Kubernetes Service where you do not need to care about Kubernetes. It's closer to a serverless running model because you do not have to care about all the infrastructure. And we will see later how Azure Container Apps does compare to Kubernetes. And we will also see where is the sweet spot for Azure Container Apps. So if you're working already with Kubernetes, that's fine, but you also might already know the complexity on how to run and how to operate Kubernetes. And if you're not yet familiar with Kubernetes, don't worry, with Azure Container Apps, you don't have to know anything about Kubernetes. So it's basically, there is a well balance, and you can just pick the right tool for your choice. And I will show you Azure Container Apps in more detail today. So what are Azure Container Apps? The tagline here says it's actually serverless containers for microservices. In just a second, I just need to move the mouse. Here we go. It should be better now. Azure Container Apps are serverless containers for microservices. So it's not a well fit if you're talking about huge monolithic applications. It's really a perfect fit if you're talking about containerized microservices, containerized applications. And you can run them in a serverless manner. What does it mean? You do not have to worry about the infrastructure. You only worry about your applications. So with that in mind, you can build modern applications built on a lot of proven open source software. And the scaling aspect, I already mentioned, scaling is like the big lever, the big power of Azure is you can scale dynamically based on events. And also for this, an open source project in KDA that is also heavily influenced by Microsoft is actually used. And this can be based on HTTP triggers or HTTP requests based on other triggers, based on CPU. So you can basically define how you want to scale your applications, with the benefit also that you can scale down to zero. So that means your application is actually not running. You will not paying for anything because your application is just idle, waiting for a request to come in. It will wake up, it will execute whatever it should execute. And then if there are no more requests, if there's no more work for the application to do, it can go down to zero and go down, scale it down to zero again. So what does it mean built on open source? So it's basically, I already mentioned KDA, which is one of the open source projects that is involved in Azure Container Apps. The other one is Dapper, that allows to build encapsulated microservices. It's basically a distributed application runtime. And you can enable Dapper directly in Azure Container Apps. But if you don't want to use it, that's totally fine. It's an optional thing that you can use, but you don't have to use it. The same is true for the whole application lifecycle management that's already built in Azure Container Apps for you. Something like seamless upgrades, seamless new deployments. So again, if you're familiar with Kubernetes, you might already know once you have a new deployment, basically the new pods, the new version of the application is coming up, traffic is shifted, and then the old pods get recycled or just they get removed. So there is no downtime in the application. It's always up and running, and traffic is shifting from the old versions to the new versions. Same is true for Azure Container Apps. And you can see here in the screenshot, you can actually also shift the traffic between different revisions, between different versions of your application, also manually. You can do this also yourself. Other things like service discovery, monitoring, everything is built in and already there for you to leverage in your applications. So with that, you don't have to focus, as said, on the infrastructure, but one very, very important aspect, at least in my point of view, is also there is no opinionated programming model. So that means usually serverless offerings, serverless products, they have some kind of dependency in your code to be able to leverage the serverless platform. So with Azure Container Apps, you do not have any dependency in your programming model. So you will just build your application, put it into a container, and then run it in Azure Container Apps. And there's also already in an integration between Azure Container Apps and GitHub Actions. So you can directly start your GitHub Actions from Azure Container Apps, and it will give you the whole GitHub Action, the whole CD workflow, basically, how to push your application to Azure. Here we go. And as said, scaling based on Keda, that's another open source framework. You can have auto scaling based on HTTP requests, which I will be using in the demo later on, but you can configure it based on other triggers, just depending on your needs. And also very important, what I already mentioned, scaling to zero. So that might be for your, let's say, for your pet projects, if you're also working on projects that you just want to kind of experience with new technologies. Scaling to zero always comes in very, very handy because it's a great way also to save costs. But also for big enterprises, it might also be very interesting because some jobs, some tasks, they only run every now and then. If they run, they can run really long. But if you might not need to have this container up and running all the time if it's, let's say, just for batch processing. So you would just start it, it will do the job, and then just go back to sleep again. So what can you build with Azure Container Apps? I would say basically anything, but there are, especially when it comes to the scaling, there are different aspects of it. So if we're talking about microservices, you might want to scale them based on HTTP requests. Same is true for public API endpoints. So you might have delivered this and built this in the past with maybe with Azure Functions, but you can now also do this with Azure Container Apps, and then you can build the scaling based on the HTTP requests that are coming in. If we want more talk about event-driven processing, where you basically have a queue and it's just kind of working on the events and messages that are coming in, you can build your auto-scaling based on the number of messages in a queue. Or if we're talking about background processing, you can do the scaling based on the level of CPU or the memory load that is actually affecting your container applications. So a lot of different things where you can think about what is the best way how to do the scaling of Azure Container Apps, but the main applicability of Azure Container Apps is quite broad. So where is now the difference between AKS and Azure Container Apps, ECA? It's quite a busy slide, and I will not go into detail of all the different lines and columns here. I can also share the slides later on. You can just reach out to me also later on in the booth or in the chat, and I will provide the slides. So what is really important is that first, the Azure Container Apps is really a platform as a service experience. You only care about your application and not so much on the infrastructure. Actually, you cannot even manage the infrastructure underneath. With Azure Kubernetes service, you still manage the infrastructure. So the managed part of the Azure Kubernetes service is basically how to operate Kubernetes, the control plane itself, how to do the updates, the upgrades of Kubernetes. That's all managed with AKS. But the underlying infrastructure, which nodes you want to have, the scaling of it, you still can manage this by yourself. Also, the deployment of the applications in Kubernetes, you would usually do this with, I don't know, like help charts or other manifests that are very, very native to Kubernetes. With Azure Container Apps, you would not need to learn Helm or any of the other, let's say, packaging tools. So you can do this with the Azure CLI or, for example, with GitHub Actions that I will show you just in a second when we go to the demo. So there are differences, and it's sometimes it's not neither or, it can be both, but you can then, based on this comparison table, you can identify what is the best fit for you. If it's either Azure Kubernetes Service to have like the higher flexibility, also being able to run operators in Kubernetes, or if you don't need the whole complexity of Kubernetes, but still want to have like just pure containers, having this orchestration of containers in the cloud, then Azure Container Apps might be just the right product for you. So before we have a look in the demo, and I'm also having a look at the no comments yet, no questions yet, at least not in the portal that I'm having a look at. So if there is anything, just shoot a comment and I will have a look. So before we go into the demo, let's just briefly go through the main concepts of Azure Container Apps. And there are a couple of concepts. Actually, you can see all of them already in this picture, and we'll go through them one by one. So the largest boundary of an Azure Container App is the Azure Container App environment. That defines the isolation and observability boundary, and you can have multiple container apps in one environment. But this is where you define where you want to build and deploy your container apps. Then you have your container apps. It's basically one independent microservice, and you can have multiple container apps in one environment. And within one container app, you can have one or multiple revisions. So a revision is basically a version of your application. It's an immutable version, actually, of your container application. And you can have multiple replicas and then decide where traffic will go, like 50-50, 80-20 percentage distribution. Or you can have a single revision where 100% of the traffic goes to one single revision. And if a new revision is coming up, it will shift the traffic automatically to the new revision, and the old revision will be just removed. So you only have one version up and running. This is what I will be using later in the demo because I don't need multiple versions of my applications running. And within the revision, basically, you have the replicas, so you can decide how many instances of the container application will run. As said, you can scale down to 0 without any costs occurring, or you can scale up to tens and hundreds of instances of your container apps. And instances, here we call it replicas, but you can scale up and you can define this by yourself. And within the actual running instance, then you actually have your containers. So here we go. How can we deploy this application? So now we have a container, we have a Docker container, for example, and now we want to run it, we want to deploy it. And I think I stole this slide actually from a presentation I saw just the other day, and I really like it because it shows the different ways how you can start, but the end is always having the Azure container running, up and running. So you can start either in the Azure portal. That's, to be honest, a very nice way to get more familiar with all the different concepts, anything that you might want to configure or might not want to configure, but you have this very good overview of what an Azure Container App is, where it's actually located, how it works all together with all the concepts that I've showed you. So the Azure portal might be a good start. Or you already want to start with the Azure CLI, where there is a specific extension, how to manage the Azure Container Apps, and you can do you can bring up your Azure Container Apps with the Azure CLI. Or you have it all in GitHub and already your actions defined in GitHub. So eventually, you will still have, like, it works really great, and we will see this in the demo, if you have your code hosted in GitHub along with the GitHub action. And the GitHub action will then take care about building and deploying, and also even testing, whatever you want to do. But the important part is it will build it and it will deploy it. This is part that you get actually automatically from the Azure Container App. So the GitHub action, you don't have to write yourself. This is why I called it like how to kickstart your journey with Azure Container Apps and your container journey, because you don't need to know how to write GitHub actions. This will be given to you for free. That's part of the Azure Container Apps, and you can just kind of have this GitHub action created for you. And I will show you what a GitHub action is, because it's around, I think it exists now for quite some time, and it's a very, very powerful CI/CD and general purpose automation within GitHub. And you can do a lot of fancy things with it, not only CI/CD. You can automate a lot of things, pull requests, issues, the labeling on the issues or pull requests. You can do a lot of things But for today, we're more focusing on the CI/CD part and how it fits into the Azure Container Applications. So in this slide, it still says like enterprise-grade CI/CD. I think that's still very, very true, although you can do more with GitHub Actions. There is a very huge, really huge variety of GitHub Actions from the community. So everyone can write a GitHub action. There is already a huge marketplace, 15,000 plus actions. I think that already speaks for itself. Are in this universe of available on GitHub in the marketplace. So you can just use a GitHub action, for example, to build a Docker container, or to deploy to an Azure function, or to deploy to an Azure Container App, or to run tests, or to basically whatever you can think of. First, have a look in the marketplace if there is already an action for that. And if not, you can start write your own action. But for most of the things you can imagine, there is already an action for that. And it's not only built by GitHub or by Microsoft, but it's actually built by the whole partner ecosystem and by the whole community. So there are actions from other providers. There are actions for deployment, for testing, for security scanning. So you name it, there are a lot of different actions. Just have a look. The action we will take a look today is actually also leveraging some other building blocks, for example, Docker. So it's already demo time. I think I should have around 20 more minutes for the demo. So let's jump into it. First, I want to show you the Azure portal. Where did I start? Here we go. So we should be able to see the Azure portal. And I heard that sometimes the mouse is a little bit flickery. So I try to not move it too fast and kind of make it a very calm and smooth experience for you. So we have it's actually my personal subscription here, and I just have one container app. It's a container app. It automatically gives me an application URL. So this container app is actually already up and running, where the you would define where the port of the Docker container that it's running this application. You can define it here in the portal or via the infrastructure as code approaches. But we will have this application up and running, and we can have a look later on what it's actually doing. It's not important at this point, I would say. So the other thing I want to show you is some of the concepts that I showed you. So for example, the revision management. We should see one revision up and running. Actually, it says provisioning. Probably we did a new deployment. It says provisioning because it's not running, because there's no traffic yet going on. So probably still go back and open this just in the background. We don't need it yet. So we have these applications, we have the revisions, and what I want to show you is also the scale and the replicas. So the important part here is that allowing to scaling down to zero, you don't have to pay for it in a pay-as-you-go mode. So my application can scale to zero if there's no traffic at all, and if there's heavy traffic, whenever like all of you today from Global Azure Austria would hit this application really hard, then it might scale up to 5 replicas. In my applications, I usually never need this, but it just gives you the idea how you can do the scaling, and it's just my setting. So you can do this yourself. You can just edit this and you can scale it, and you can see also that the replicas up and running. So I have one replica. It's just created a couple of seconds ago. It's ready. So if I'm going back here, you can already see this is the application I was talking. I want to show you. I don't want to go into detail what it's actually doing, but it's basically creating and showing me from a music website the records of the week with from this specific music website, what are the best records of this week that the people at this music website did listen to. And I see here, like created with love by myself, with the source on GitHub. Everything's available if you ever want to have a look at it. So it's up and running. That's really cool. So in the next part, let's have a look. How did I deploy it to Azure? So let's have a look here. Just checking on the second screen if you can see it. Yes. It should be big enough. Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. Here we go. So here, or can I just only use this window? No, I don't know. Here we go. What we can see here, it's actually, that's the GitHub action. It has a name, and 99% of this GitHub action, they were created for me automatically from the Azure portal. So in the Azure portal, there's one part. Actually, let me just go back real quick and show you this. With the continuous deployment option, you can just say, here we go. My organization, my GitHub organization is basically my personal account. This is the repository, and I want to have the action from the main branch in this workflow repository, workflow folder. Here I want to have this action, and it will put the action into this folder, and the outcome we can see here in Visual Studio Code. So this is what Azure was giving me, and I already have the application up and running. The GitHub action available here, even with the comments. So it's pretty much self-explaining. So what it says here, whenever there's a new version of main on the specific path here, because the application I have, the whole application consists of different parts, different microservices. And here I would only care about deploying the web UI, the user interface, to Azure Container Apps. The rest goes somewhere else. So only if there is any change in this path on the main branch, this will be triggered. And what it does is basically it checks out the code, it sets up the building and the Docker, logging into Docker. It will build it and push it to my Docker, organization or Docker repository. That's the build part. And then following comes the deploy part. It needs the build part. This is what it says. So it's basically, this is how they get concatenated. So the deploy part only runs if the build part was successful. In here, it will log in to Azure with a secret that it's defined in GitHub, so we can also have the Azure credentials, and it will deploy the container app using the official CLI for Azure. So you could also do this yourself, just from the Azure CLI from your machine, but this is not what we want to do, because we will always want to have the version that we have in GitHub should be the same version that you have online. So I would not recommend that you would push this yourself, but always just check in the code on GitHub, merge it into the main branch, and off you go. The rest will be taken care of from the GitHub action. So what we can do is, hopefully, we can just change it here a little bit. Sorry, it's very small. So it was actually a little bit easier if it was smaller. Oh, here we go. Created with love for Global Azure Austria 2023. And this is what we want to change. Let's just say if it's, yeah. So I will just do a git commit on this file, commit-m-gaa 2023 demo, and I will push it directly to main. You should not do this, but it's a demo. So for a demo, I think you can forgive me with not following a best practice, but here we go. Oh, sorry. So here we go. And I should actually open this on GitHub, because this is where we want to have a look. So just having a look at the time, still a couple of minutes left. So we can see here, there is some actions running. I just do it here. And there is a trigger deployment on Azure Container Apps. And now let's have a look at all the steps that we just saw in the workflow file. You can now see all the steps are executed. And I know it might be a little bit small for you to read, but it's not important what it actually does in detail. The important part is we have the building part. So this job is the build part. It will build the Docker container. It will push the Docker container to Docker Hub. Once that's finished, it will start the deploy part. And the deploy part, it will then use the Docker container, the Docker image actually, and will deploy it to Azure Container Apps. There are other actions in parallel also ongoing, like linting the code. I did not change a lot, but you can have a lot of other actions ongoing in parallel. In my case, I just want to show you how to push it and deploy it to Azure Container Apps. So we can see here now the deploy part. It's now logging in to Azure. It's a little bit small. Logging in to Azure and deploying the container app. So let's have a look into the Azure portal, because for the revisions, we should see a new revision coming up just in a second. Not there yet, not there yet. Let's just briefly, let me check back. It's still deploying, so it's not yet finished. So once it's has finished the deploying, it's installing this extension to the CLI that I was mentioning earlier. Once it does the deployment of this new version of the container app, we will see a new revision coming up. Once it's up and running, you will see all the traffic shifting from the old version to the new version. And then we will also be able to see the new version live on the URL that was given to me already from Azure Container Apps. So I don't have to bring my own domain. What you can do, you can still bring your own domain, but like for projects where you don't need it, you don't have to buy a domain and still have your application up and running and available online. So let's check, maybe it's here now. Oh, here we go. So now we can see there is a new version provision and traffic was already shifted to the new version. So let's have a look also here. I'm reloading this page and we can see created with love for Global Azure Austria 2023. So the really cool thing is that anything I do in in GitHub on my application, I just commit it to GitHub, and the GitHub action that was given to me automatically was for free. I did not write the GitHub action myself. I just kind of changed a couple of words. This will take care and push the application to Azure. So let me just double check if there's anything else I want to show you. So here we go. We should be able to see this and we can have a look on all the actions that were running for this deployment. You can see there were a couple of other actions like linting my Go code, checking with Go code QL on different on my code if there's any vulnerabilities or any issues with my code, and also doing a couple of other things. Also, for some part, also it was actually updating my Azure function in the background. So I think this was most of the demo I wanted to show you. As you can see, also you can find here Pepper if you might ever need it. And let's go back briefly to the slides. So here we go. Demo time. We just did the demo. Awesome. So if you want to see more on Azure Container Apps or anything on Azure, join us at Microsoft Build. It's starting in about 1 or 2 weeks. End of May, Microsoft Build, build.microsoft.com. Feel free to sign up, join online, or join a local watch party that will happen also in the offices of Microsoft in Vienna if you want to join. I have here a couple of resources. Basically, they all start with aka.ms/container apps. If you go there, you will find most of the information of Azure Container Apps directly there. Or you go to learn.microsoft.com. That's a great resource where you can also find how to deploy Azure Container Apps with demos, with documentation, how to define the scaling of it, and also examples. So it's a really, really great resource. And I've also selected some of the resources for you from the Microsoft community, or from the Microsoft newsletter. So really, really up-to-date information on Azure Container Apps. I will also share this with you. And if there are any more questions, I don't see any questions right now in the chat. If there are any questions, My avatar in GatherTown will get active just in a couple of minutes again. So just join us on the Microsoft booth here in GatherTown and enjoy the rest of this awesome event, Global Azure Austria 2023. Thank you so much.